I'm not exactly sure where to start, because even now, it's hard to wrap my head around everything that happened that night. It was Christmas Eve, and I remember thinking that, despite all the chaos of the year, that day finally felt like it might bring a little bit of peace. The house was all decked out with lights twinkling on the porch, and the sweet smell of cookies baking was coming from the kitchen. My dad, who's usually so busy and serious, actually seemed relaxed for once. He had recently retired from the clinic where he worked, and my mom used to say that was the best thing for him, because the last few years had been a heavy burden. But no one could have predicted something was so wrong. The night started off normal, with my dad laughing at something silly my little brother said. It was rare to see him like that, but at the same time, something felt off. It was like there was this tension in the air that no one could explain. He kept giving these strange, lingering looks, like he wasn't really there. I figured maybe he was just tired or had had a little too much wine. The moment everything changed came so suddenly. It's like a blur in my mind. One minute, we were all in the living room exchanging presents, and the next, my dad was standing there, eyes wide, breathing heavy, holding one of the fireplace candlesticks like it was a weapon. I don't know how to explain what I felt in that moment. Maybe just an instinct that something was seriously, seriously wrong. My mom was the first to speak up, trying to figure out why he was acting that way. "John, what's going on? Are you okay?" she asked, with that gentle, concerned tone she always used. But he didn't answer. He just stood there, frozen, muscles tensed, that heavy candlestick still in his hand. That's when he started screaming. It wasn't clear words, just disconnected phrases full of rage and pain. It was like he was fighting something or someone inside his own head. My little brother, who was only 10, started crying. I wanted to run to him, hold him, and protect him, but I was frozen too. My mom stepped forward, trying to calm him down, but that's when he turned and shoved her so hard she fell to the floor, hitting her head on the corner of the coffee table. It happened so fast and so unexpectedly that all I could do was scream. He had never been violent before. Never. In my mind, my dad was a serious but loving man who always took care of us. Seeing him like that, it felt like I was looking at a completely different person. That push was enough to turn everything into pure chaos. My mom was on the floor, dazed, trying to get up while my dad started moving toward me and my brother. I managed to pull my brother behind the Christmas tree, using the branches as a kind of shield. It was terrifying. The glow of the colored lights on my dad's face made everything feel even more surreal, like I was trapped in a never-ending nightmare. He kept screaming nonsensical things, words that didn't make sense, mixing accusations against us with random stuff about work, money, and something about everything being over. That's when I realized I had to do something. I saw my mom trying to get up again, but she was clearly hurt and disoriented. My dad turned toward her, and I knew if he got any closer, it wouldn't end well. Without thinking, I grabbed one of the glass ornaments from the tree and threw it at him. It hit his shoulder and shattered, distracting him just for a second, but that was enough for me to grab my brother's hand and run toward the back door. My heart felt like it was going to explode, and all I could think about was getting out of there before he caught us. We managed to get out through the back door, and the cold Christmas Eve air hit my face like a shock. The lawn was covered in snow, and I almost slipped as I ran, dragging my brother behind me. He was sobbing from fear, and all I could do was whisper, "It's gonna be okay," over and over, even though I didn't believe it myself. Our house was surrounded by a small forest, and I knew that if we could make it there, we might have a chance to hide. As we ran, I heard the sound of glass breaking inside the house, and soon after, the heavy footsteps of my dad following us. When we entered the woods, the silence was replaced by this strange, almost surreal sound. The crunch of snow beneath our feet mixed with my heavy breathing and the snap of branches breaking. I looked back once and saw my dad standing at the edge of the woods, holding something I couldn't quite make out. He was just watching us, not moving, but his eyes. It was like he was staring straight at me, even from a distance. It was the most terrifying look I'd ever seen in my life, like he wasn't the same person anymore. For a few minutes, I thought maybe he wouldn't follow us, but then I heard the branches snapping behind us. He was coming, and it felt like he knew exactly where we were, even with the woods being so dark. My brother started sobbing louder, and I tried to quiet him, but it was useless. The sound of his footsteps was getting closer and closer. I remembered a small shed at the far end of the woods, a place my dad used to keep old tools. If we could make it there, maybe we could lock ourselves inside. When I saw the shed, a tiny spark of hope flickered, but it was like my dad had sensed our plan. He started running, and the sound of his heavy footsteps in the snow now seemed deafening. My brother tripped and fell, but I lifted him up with every ounce of strength I had. The shed was just a few yards away, and I practically threw my brother inside when we reached the door. I locked it quickly, but the latch was old, and I knew it wouldn't hold for long. He arrived just after, banging on the door with such force it sounded like he was going to tear it off its hinges. Inside the shed, everything felt cramped and even more suffocating. The only light came from a crack in the door, where the Christmas lights from our house blinked in the distance. My brother was curled up in a corner, crying softly, while I tried to find something to defend myself with. The place was full of rusty tools, old boxes, and a handsaw that looked like it had been used for decades. I grabbed the saw, even though I knew it probably wouldn't do much if he managed to get in. The door kept shaking with each knock, every one harder than the last. My dad wasn't shouting anymore. His silence was worse than anything. After what felt like an eternity, the banging stopped. I didn't know if that was a good or bad sign. I tried to listen. But I didn't hear any more footsteps or movement. My brother looked at me with those wide, terrified eyes, and all I could do was hold him. We stayed like that, frozen, while time dragged on. Finally, I got the courage to peek through the crack in the door. My dad wasn't there, just the trampled snow and the shadow of the woods, but still, I couldn't open the door. Something inside me told me it was a trap, that he was waiting for us to come out. We stayed in the shed for what felt like an eternity. My brother eventually fell asleep in my arms, even though he was shivering from the cold. I didn't know what to do. I didn't have my phone with me, and I couldn't go outside to ask for help without risking running into him. The silence outside was disturbing, and the more I tried to listen for something, the more it felt like my mind was playing tricks on me, like the wind in the branches was whispering my name. I almost gave up on waiting and was about to open the door when I heard the sound of snow crunching again. Slow, heavy footsteps. He was back. My heart raced. This time, he didn't try to force the door. Instead, I heard the shed's wood being scratched, like he was dragging something sharp against it. The sound was low but constant, and it seemed to make the cold I already felt even worse. I couldn't see what he was doing, but I could imagine. He was toying with us, doing it on purpose to make me terrified. After a while, the sound stopped again, and this time, when I peeked through the crack, there was nothing. No sign of him. Just the emptiness and the snow, lit by the house lights in the distance. I didn't know what to do anymore. Something inside me told me to wait until dawn, but the cold was becoming unbearable, and my brother was starting to move, quietly complaining of pain. I needed to make a decision, risk going out or stay here and hope he wouldn't come back. I took a deep breath and finally unlocked the door. The sound of the latch opening seemed to echo through the woods, and my heart was beating so fast I could barely hear anything else. I pushed the door open slowly, ready to pull back at the slightest sign of movement, but there was nothing. Everything was strangely quiet. I carried my brother in my arms and we started walking back toward the house, but every step felt like an eternity. The tracks in the snow, which had once come and gone from the shed, were now partially erased, like the wind had blown over them. When we finally reached the back door, the house was silent. There was no sign of movement inside. With trembling hands, I turned the doorknob. It was unlocked. I entered cautiously, and the scene in the living room felt surreal. The Christmas tree was still glowing, with presents scattered on the floor, and my mom wasn't where we'd left her. There was no sign of a struggle, like nothing had happened. I was stunned. How could the house look normal? The blood I was sure I'd seen when my mom hit her head wasn't there anymore. Everything seemed tidy, but at the same time, wrong. My brother was still in my arms, and I laid him down on the couch, trying to think about what to do next. "Mom?" I called, my voice shaking. No answer. I slowly climbed the stairs, each step creaking as if warning me not to keep going. I reached the hallway and saw that the door to my parents' bedroom was slightly open. My heart almost stopped when I noticed a shadow moving inside. I froze, trying to hear any sound. The shadow seemed to move from side to side, but it was silent. Carefully, I pushed the door with the tips of my fingers, and the room was empty. The streetlight outside lit the room partially, and only then did I notice the strangest detail. The closet was open, and all of my dad's clothes and belongings were gone. It was like he had never existed. A wave of panic hit me so hard that I had to steady myself against the wall to keep from collapsing. Nothing made sense, and that only made everything even more terrifying. I ran down the stairs quickly, trying to piece together the parts of this macabre puzzle, but nothing made sense. My brother was still on the couch, now fully awake, staring at me with those terrified eyes. "Where's Dad?" he asked, his voice low, like he was afraid to be heard. I didn't know how to answer. How could I explain something I didn't even understand? Before I could say anything, we heard a noise coming from the kitchen. It was subtle, like a chair being dragged across the floor. My nerves were on edge, so I grabbed the nearest knife I could find on the counter and moved toward the kitchen slowly. When I looked inside, the scene looked like something out of a nightmare. The chair at the table was overturned, and on the table, among all the Christmas decorations, was the candlestick my dad had been holding earlier, now stained with what looked like dried blood. My whole body froze. In that moment, I knew we weren't alone in the house. Something or someone was toying with us, and I didn't know if it was my dad or something worse. I grabbed my brother by the hand and decided we couldn't stay there another second. No matter what was going on, that house wasn't safe. As I pulled him toward the front door, the noise started again. The same scraping sound we had heard at the shed, only now it was coming from the walls of the living room. It was low, but unmistakable, and it seemed to follow us as we moved. My brother started crying again, and I felt like I was on the edge of losing control. We reached the door, but when I tried to turn the doorknob, it wouldn't budge. It was locked, and the key that was always there was gone. I started banging on the door, shouting for help, but the sound seemed muffled, like the very air in the house was trapping us. Then something even stranger happened. The Christmas tree lights began to flicker uncontrollably, casting frantic shadows all over the room. Every time they blinked, it seemed like the shadows on the wall were moving on their own, as if they were alive. The last thing I remember before I passed out was the sound of something falling to the floor behind me. When I woke up, everything was quiet again, and the smell of burnt pine filled the air. When I regained consciousness, the room was dark, except for the faint light of morning starting to come through the windows. My brother was beside me, still asleep, or maybe unconscious, I wasn't sure. I slowly got up, feeling my whole body ache, and looked around. The Christmas tree was burned, the branches twisted, and the presents underneath it had been reduced to ashes. The candlestick, which had been in the kitchen the night before, was now back on the fireplace, spotless, as if nothing had happened. I called my brother's name and he slowly opened his eyes, confused. "It's okay, we're leaving now," I said, trying to hide the panic in my voice. When I tried to open the front door again, this time it gave way easily, like it had never been locked. We stepped outside, and everything was absurdly normal. Neighbors were starting to decorate their lawns, kids were playing in the snow, and a mail truck was passing slowly by. I looked at our house, and for a moment, I thought I saw a figure in the window of my parents' bedroom, but when I blinked, it was gone. We walked down the street, not looking back, and went straight to our neighbor, Mrs. Carter's house. She was a sweet lady who always invited us over for cookies and hot chocolate. When she opened the door, her expression changed to pure shock. "What happened to you?" she asked, but I couldn't answer. I just asked to use the phone. I called the police, trying to explain everything that had happened, but my voice sounded disconnected, almost incoherent. They said they'd send someone right away. When the police arrived, I told them everything I remembered, but when they entered the house, they found nothing out of the ordinary. My mom was in the kitchen, making coffee, like nothing had happened, and she seemed genuinely confused as to why there were cops there. My dad? He was just gone. No mention of him, no concern. When I asked where he was, My mom looked at me with a strange expression and said, "Sweetheart, your dad died 5 years ago." My brother and I exchanged a look of pure terror. To this day, I don't know what happened that night. All I know is that we never went back to that house.
Please subscribe our YouTube channel.
I never imagined that Christmas, my favorite time of year, would turn into one of the most terrifying days of my life. It was December 24th, and our house was all decked out. Twinkling lights, a tree full of ornaments, and gifts wrapped in shiny paper. My mom was in the kitchen getting the Christmas dinner ready, while my younger brother and I were watching a holiday movie in the living room. My dad, as usual, seemed to enjoy all the chaos, laughing as he arranged the presents under the tree. Then, someone knocked at the door. I thought it was odd because it was already night, and we weren't expecting anyone. My dad opened the door, and there was a package. It was wrapped up neatly in red paper with a gold bow, looking just like a regular Christmas gift. But there was no return address, no tag, just this seemingly innocent box. My dad brought the package into the living room, curious but not thinking much of it. He figured it might be something from a neighbor or a family friend, but nobody recognized the wrapping. I remember my mom shouting from the kitchen, asking what it was, and he laughed, saying he was going to open it and see. He put the box on the coffee table, right in the middle of the room, and started untying the bow. I felt this strange discomfort in that moment, something I couldn't explain, like that package shouldn't be there. It was a split second between him lifting the lid and the deafening sound that followed. An explosion. The kind of noise that makes everything around you feel like it's moving in slow motion. The Christmas lights seemed to go out along with my dad's life. Everything turned into chaos. When I finally opened my eyes, everything was a blur. The living room that had been filled with lights and decorations was now a scene of destruction. The tree was knocked over, the windows shattered, and smoke filled the air. My mom came running from the kitchen, screaming, but when she saw what was in front of her, she froze. My dad. He was there, lying still. The explosion hit him directly, and as much as I wanted to believe he might still be alive, there was no doubt. My little brother was crying uncontrollably, and all I could do was stare at the destroyed package, now just pieces scattered all over the floor. That gift had just taken my dad from us. The police arrived shortly after, probably alerted by neighbors who heard the blast. I remember how shocked they were when they entered the room, like they'd never seen anything like it before. They quickly secured the scene, and we were taken outside, where the cold Christmas night felt even more brutal. One of the officers tried to comfort us, but no one knew what to say. I kept wondering over and over, who would do something like this? Why? They started going through the remnants of the package while another officer was asking my mom questions. She was in shock, barely able to speak. All we could say was that the package had just appeared at our door. There was nothing that could have prepared us for something like this. The next few days were a blur of questions and fear. The police didn't waste any time telling us it wasn't an accident. The explosion had been caused by a homemade device, something built with the clear intent to kill. My mind couldn't process it. Who could hate us so much to do something like this? The investigators started digging into my dad's history, from his friends to the places he worked, trying to find any lead. That's when they found an old dispute from one of his jobs, something that had happened years ago. It didn't seem like a big deal, but the cop told us that kind of resentment can build up over time. The question was, how could someone go so far over something so old? Despite the investigation, the lack of answers only made everything feel more suffocating. The days turned into weeks, and soon Christmas felt like a distant nightmare. But the fear never went away. Every time someone knocked at the door, my mom would freeze, and my brother would cry at the slightest loud noise. The Christmas lights that used to bring so much joy now seemed like a dark reminder of what we'd lost. The scariest part? Even with all the investigation, the police never figured out who sent that package. No fingerprints, No security cameras caught anything. It was like the person responsible had just vanished. The case was closed, but for us, the horror was far from over. From that point on, our lives were completely changed. The house that used to be full of laughter and Christmas traditions turned into a heavy place, full of silence. My mom could barely sleep. I'd hear her walking around the house in the middle of the night, checking locks and peering out the window, like she was waiting for something or someone to show up again. My brother started having constant nightmares, waking up in the middle of the night screaming that the box is back. I couldn't blame him. Sometimes I even felt like something was watching us. Every time I looked at the front door, I'd get a chill, like at any moment another package could show up. No matter how hard we tried to move on, it was impossible to ignore that emptiness. Some people in town started avoiding us. Maybe it was fear, or maybe they just didn't know how to deal with what happened. "It's awful what happened to them," I heard someone whisper at the store once. Others looked at us with pity, like we were a cursed family. The police, although they tried to reassure us, admitted the case would probably never be solved. That maybe echoed in my head all the time. Who did this? Why my dad? Could they come back? The investigators told us that cases like this, with no solid suspects, can stay open for years. But deep down, it felt like they had already given up. That feeling of powerlessness was what really ate away at us. Even as the years went by, we never felt completely safe. Every holiday, especially Christmas, came with a heavy tension. My mom decided she'd never set up a tree or put up lights again, like that would stop another disaster from happening. We moved not long after, but the fear came with us. It's hard to explain, but it felt like changing addresses didn't get rid of the feeling of being watched. I even avoided opening regular deliveries, like letters or boxes that came in the mail. No matter how harmless something seemed, the trauma made my heart race every time. I heard the sound of a package being dropped on the porch. Even after all these years, some nights are especially hard. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night with that image in my head. The red package, the gold bow, my dad's curious expression as he opened the lid. The sound of the explosion still echoes in my ears, even so long after. I know we'll never find out who did it, and maybe that's the scariest part. Knowing that person could be out there, living their life like nothing ever happened, while ours was shattered. Sometimes I wonder, was it someone we knew? Or just a complete stranger who decided to make us their target? Those questions are like a constant weight, and I've learned that maybe I'll never get the answers. Over time, the pain turned into a chilling kind of apathy. It was like we were always waiting for something bad to happen again. My mom tried therapy, but she quit after a few weeks, saying reliving everything just made it worse. My brother, now a teenager, avoids talking about that day. He's closed off in a way no one can break through. And me. I try to pretend everything's fine, but I know it never will be. Especially at Christmas. Every year, when December comes, everyone around us gets into the holiday spirit, and all I feel is a mix of anguish and anger. How can the world just keep going like nothing happened? How can someone decorate a tree or open a present without feeling fear? And then, every Christmas without fail, I look at the front door and wait. I don't know why I do it. Maybe part of me believes that one day that package will come back. Maybe this time there'll be a note explaining everything. Or maybe it's just the irrational fear that something like this could happen again. Either way, I can't shake the feeling that this story isn't over. The person responsible is still out there. And who's to say they won't show up again? We'll never have a normal Christmas again, and I don't think we ever will. The only thing that's left is this emptiness, and the certainty that something as simple as a package can destroy a family forever.
Please subscribe our YouTube channel.
I've always loved Christmas. It was my favorite time of the year. The city would light up with decorations, houses were all festive, and you'd get that smell of cookies baking in the oven. Everything just felt lighter, happier. But after what happened 2 years ago, I can't look at this time of year the same way anymore. To this day, every time I see a wreath on a door or hear a Christmas song, I get that knot in my stomach, that awful feeling that something's really wrong, even when everything is quiet. It was right before Christmas when the woman from next door, Anne, just disappeared. She was 7 months pregnant, always smiling, and then the next day, no one knew where she was. I knew Anne well enough to exchange pleasantries and quick chats when we crossed paths. She was the kind of person who seemed to have a perfect life, you know? Beautiful, friendly, with a husband who looked like he stepped out of a TV commercial. They'd only moved onto our street about 6 months before, and they were already the talk of the neighborhood. Her husband, Henry, was kind of reserved, but Anne made up for it. She talked to everyone, always so upbeat. The day she disappeared, I remember seeing Henry standing by their gate with a weird look on his face. He was just standing there, staring off into space, and I thought about asking if everything was okay. But I didn't, and I still regret it to this day. That day, the street felt different, quieter than usual, like everyone knew something bad was about to happen, but no one had the guts to say it out loud. It was a Sunday, I remember, because I saw Henry's car parked out front. Normally, he'd leave early on weekends to hit the gym or something, but that day, he was there, and he seemed more jittery than usual. When the police showed up a few hours later, it felt like time stopped. I didn't know what was going on, but I could already tell it wasn't good. The neighbor across the street was the first to say Anne was missing. From what I heard later, Henry called the police and said she'd gone for a walk the evening before and never came back. That didn't make any sense, though, because the neighborhood was super quiet, and Anne always said she didn't like walking alone at night. But what made everyone even more suspicious was how calm Henry was. He didn't seem panicked, you know? He was more focused on answering the police's questions than actually looking for his wife. That's when things started to get out of hand. The investigation kicked off quickly, and the whole neighborhood turned into a bit of a stage. Police cars, neighbors whispering by their gates, reporters trying to get the scoop. It was weird to watch Henry stay so calm while all this was happening. He even let the cops into their house without hesitating, like there was nothing to hide. But at the same time, it felt forced, like he was trying to convince everyone he was innocent. The thing is, as the days went by, more and more strange things came up about him. People said their marriage wasn't all it seemed. Some neighbors swore they'd seen Henry with another woman, a blonde no one recognized, getting into his car. Meanwhile, something kept bothering me. The house next door, Mrs. Goldsmith's. She'd lived there for decades, a quiet, polite woman, but in the days leading up to Anne's disappearance, I noticed she was watching Anne a lot. I remember seeing her through the kitchen window, standing at her gate for minutes, just watching Anne unload groceries. At the time, I thought she was just being nosy, but after Anne vanished, Goldsmith seemed different. She stayed inside all day, and the lights in her house stayed on all night, like she was afraid of something. It wasn't until a few days later that things started taking an even more unsettling turn. The police were focused on Henry, investigating his alleged affairs and the inconsistencies in what he was saying. But something made me keep an eye on Mrs. Goldsmith's house. I couldn't ignore the fact that she always seemed to be lurking around. One afternoon, when I went to take the trash out, I saw something that made my heart stop. She was cleaning something in the backyard, and there was a dark stain on the ground near what looked like a rolled-up rug. I couldn't tell what it was, but my mind went straight to the worst-case scenario. I thought about telling the police, but honestly, I was scared. I didn't want to believe that such a quiet, polite lady could be involved in something so horrible. That night, while I was trying to sleep, I heard a noise coming from her house. It sounded like someone was crying, very softly. It didn't seem like Mrs. Goldsmith, but who else could it be? My window faced her house, and when I looked, I saw the basement light on. I don't know why, but I just froze, watching. A little while later, the light turned off and everything went quiet again. I tried to convince myself I was imagining things, but that feeling that something was terribly wrong wouldn't go away. The next day, I told my neighbor, who agreed that we should call the police. And that's exactly what we did. But what happened next was even stranger. When the police showed up at Mrs. Goldsmith's house, everything seemed normal. She greeted them at the door with her usual calm and polite demeanor, even offered them coffee, like she had nothing to hide. The scene felt so surreal that I started to think maybe I was just being paranoid. But then, something changed. One of the officers asked to go inside and check the basement, and I saw her face go pale right away. She tried to cover it up, saying the basement was locked because it held some old things, but they insisted. That's when she started shaking, and to everyone's shock, she fainted right there in the hallway. While the paramedics arrived, the officers decided to break down the basement door. I wasn't inside, of course, but what I heard from those who were was enough to make me feel sick. The smell that came out was awful, almost like a warning that something very wrong was hidden down there. It didn't take long for them to find what looked like a small altar, with pictures of Anne scattered around, melted candles, and objects that clearly belonged to her, like the scarf she always wore. There was no sign of her body, but what they found was more than enough to send chills down everyone's spine. After that discovery, Mrs. Goldsmith was taken away by the police. The whole neighborhood was in shock. Some people said she had to be crazy, others started to believe she had something to do with Anne's disappearance. But what really gave me the creeps was that, even with all that, the case still wasn't solved. The police searched the entire house, including the basement, but didn't find any sign of Anne or anything that explained where she might be. It was like she had just disappeared into thin air. Henry remained under suspicion, but by then, even he seemed more lost than guilty. The strangest part came a few nights later. Mrs. Goldsmith's house was empty, sealed by the police, but I swear I saw a light on in the basement. It was late, and I was about to close the window when I noticed that faint glow coming from there. My heart raced. There was no way anyone could be inside. For a moment, I thought about calling the police, but fear froze me. I just watched until the light went out again, like nothing had ever happened. To this day, I don't know if I really saw that or if my mind was playing tricks on me, but that was the last strange thing to happen at that house. After that basement light incident, things started to calm down, at least on the surface. The police kept investigating, but the clues got more and more confusing. Henry was released for lack of evidence, and even though Mrs. Goldsmith stayed in custody, she never confessed to anything. The media speculated about everything, from dark rituals to theories involving human trafficking. But the truth is, no one knew for sure what had happened to Anne, and that was the scariest part. She had simply vanished, and even with all the attention the case got, it felt like the earth just swallowed her up. To this day, when I pass by Mrs. Goldsmith's old house, I get a shiver down my spine. She never came back, of course, and the house stayed empty for a long time. The next Christmas, a new family moved in, and although they painted the front and fixed up the yard, I can't look at that place without remembering everything. The strangest thing? The new lady told me once that sometimes she feels like she's being watched from the basement. I don't know if it's just paranoia or something truly strange, but one thing's for sure. Christmas has never been the same for me. Every time this time of year rolls around, that emptiness and the feeling that something terrible was left unanswered come back, like a knot in my throat.
Please subscribe our YouTube channel.